This is the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. I usually don't do incidents that have been on air crash investigation, partly because they do such a good job of explaining the accident that my attempt is just going to pale in comparison. But I've wanted to do an episode on Eastern Airlines Flight 401 for so long, because since the first time I saw the episode on ACI as a kid, the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 has stuck with me. For me, personally, it's the closest airplane analog of the Titanic. Think about it. A cutting-edge airplane with the best tech money can buy goes down due to simple human mistakes. The fact that it was so preventable just makes it that much more heartbreaking. On the 29th of December 1972, an Eastern Airlines L-1011 was flying from JFK International Airport to Miami International Airport. The plane lifted off from JFK at 9:20 p.m. with 163 passengers and 13 crew members. Everyone on board expected a routine flight, and that's what it seemed like for most of the flight. The plane climbed and it cruised over the eastern seaboard. I imagine that the passengers on that night looked out and saw twinkling lights of major cities on one side and the black expanse of the Atlantic on another. As they closed in on Miami, the plane started to descend. As they prepared to land, the captain lowered the gear. To make sure that the gears are down and locked, the pilots have a cluster of lights on their console. Each light corresponds to a landing gear bogey. If the light is green, it means that the gear is down and locked. If it isn't green, it signifies an issue with the landing gear. It may not have deployed properly, and on this night, the nose gear light doesn't light up. The captain cycles the gears in the hopes that it will fix the issue. At 11:34 p.m., Flight 401 radios Miami and says, "Well, Tower, this is Eastern Air 401. It looks like we're going to have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet." Miami Tower hands them back off to approach control and asks them to climb back up to 2,000 feet. As they passed right over the airport, Flight 401 radios approach control. "All right, approach control, Eastern 401. We're right over the airport here and climbing to 2,000 feet. After having told approach control about their nose gear issue, approach control asked them to maintain 2,000 feet and to turn right to 360 degrees. At 11:36 p.m., the captain asked the first officer who was flying the plane to engage the autopilot. Control now asked them to fly a heading of 300. Shortly afterward, the first officer removed the bulb from his mounting to see if he could work out if the bulb was in working order. If the bulb was broken, that would explain why the green light failed to illuminate, but he couldn't get the bulb back into its mounting. The captain ordered the flight engineer to go down into the belly of the airplane to visually confirm if the nose gear was down and locked. On the L-1011, there was a hatch in the cockpit that you could use to gain access to an area near the nose gear. From here, you'd be able to see two rods in the landing gear linkage. With a small light, one would be able to see these rods. If the rods were lined up, it meant that the gear was down and locked. On the flight recorder, at this very moment, a 0.04 G force was recorded and the plane had descended just a bit. Approach control now asked the crew to fly 270 degrees. The crew radioed approach control, letting them know that they intended on staying in the holding pattern a bit longer as they continued to troubleshoot the issue. A small sound was played in the cockpit, indicating that the plane was now 250 feet below the altitude that the pilots had set on the autopilot, but no one even seemed to notice the sound. No one commented on it. At 11:41 p.m., the flight engineer says, "I can't see it, it's pitch dark," and I throw the little light and I get nothing. He wasn't able to see the rods because it was too dark. An Eastern Airlines maintenance specialist in the jump seat offers to help the flight engineer, and he goes down to help him. Approach control pops up and asks, "Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?" On his radar scope, he saw that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was at 900 feet. This was well below their altitude of 2,000 feet. He wanted to know if everything was okay. Flight 401 responded with, "Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in." They were ready to go back to the airport. At 11:42 p.m., the first officer says, "We did something to the altitude." The captain responds with a confused, "What?" Seeing their altitude, the first officer exclaims, "We're still at 2,000, right?" A small beeping noise could be heard from the radio altimeter, indicating that the plane was dangerously low. Then the sound of impact, and then nothing. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 had gone down 19 miles west-northwest of Miami International Airport. 101 people lost their lives and 75 people survived the crash. After the accident, one of the first things that the investigators did was talk to the air traffic controller at Miami International Airport. Miami International Airport was equipped with an ARTS 3 radar system that was cutting edge at the time. The system also displayed the altitude of the airplane along with its radar plot, so controllers could see potential altitude conflicts, if any. On the night of the crash, the controller did in fact notice that the plane was dangerously low. The controller saw that the plane was at 900 feet, and this is when he decided to ask Flight 401 to see if everything was okay. The crew responded, and they did not mention any problems. The ARTS 3 system sometimes displayed incorrect altitudes, and it may take up to 3 scans for the altitude to revert back to the correct value. The controller assumed that the displayed altitude was wrong. Once Flight 401 responded saying that they're okay, the controller went back to controlling 5 other flights in his airspace, and so the one person that could have alerted the crew to their dangerously low altitude lost his chance. The ARTS 3 system was never designed for terrain clearance, and the FAA guidelines made it clear that it wasn't the controller's job to provide altitude alerts to the pilots. This controller had gone above and beyond of what was expected of him. Looking at the wreckage, the investigators are astounded that anyone even survived the crash. The plane has been ripped to shreds. A factor that helped people survive was the seats of the L-1011. The L-1011 seats had energy absorbers, which dampened the effects of the crash to an extent. Moreover, the seats were attached to the basic aircraft structure, which made them very sturdy compared to regular airplane seats. The investigators looked at a few possible theories for the crash. The first one is subtle incapacitation. In the captain's autopsy, a tumor was found. The tumor was near the part of the brain which was responsible for peripheral vision. If his peripheral vision was compromised, it might explain why he did not notice the altimeter as he focused his attention on the landing gear lights. But medical experts ruled this theory out, as the effects of the tumor would not have been severe enough to incapacitate the captain. The autopilot was considered next. Once they started to troubleshoot the issues with the landing lights, the captain ordered the co-pilot to engage the autopilot, which he did. The co-pilot set the autopilot to 2,000 feet. 288 seconds before the impact, the flight data recorder recorded a 0.04 g force, causing the plane to drop at about 200 feet per minute. For this to happen, someone must have disengaged the autopilot by choice or by accident. Comparing the FDR data to the CVR data, the investigators realized that the plane started its gradual descent just as the captain said, Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down." The captain was talking to the flight engineer who was seated behind the captain. And in the process of turning around to talk to the flight engineer, it is possible that the captain might have nudged the control column. If you apply enough force on the control column, it is possible to disengage the autopilot. We are now 160 seconds from impact, and thrust to the engines has been reduced. The auto throttle system from the plane was tested extensively to figure out why there was a power reduction in this crucial phase of flight. They incorporate the auto throttle from the accident airplane into another plane to see if the auto throttle behaves in a similar manner. It doesn't. The auto throttle does not pull back power on the test airplane. Another thing that doesn't add up is how the power was reduced. First, power from engines 2 and 3 was reduced. Then engine 1 was brought down to the level of engines 2 and 3. Then power on engine number 1 was dropped, and soon engine numbers 2 and 3 followed. Had the auto throttle been commanding these power reductions, they all would have happened simultaneously, as the throttles were driven by one servo motor. They postulate that one of the pilots might have inadvertently bumped the throttles. They were trying to fix the bulb after all. The other theory is that they were supposed to be maintaining 170 knots, but since they were a bit above that speed, the pilots might have pulled back on the throttles just a bit to keep the speed in check. In the pilot's head, the autopilot is keeping the plane at 2,000 feet, and so they might have just looked at the speed and made the adjustments on the throttles. The investigators think that the throttles were pulled back by one of the pilots to keep the speed in check. The C cord that was played in the cockpit should have alerted the pilots to their low altitude, but it did not. They were too focused on fixing the broken bulb. Another issue that the investigators found was that the pilots were becoming too dependent on the automation that these new planes provided. As automation became more and more capable, pilots started to monitor their instruments a lot less. They placed a lot of faith in the automation. Pilots that testified in public hearings after the crash stated that pilots relied on the automation of the aircraft to a degree that the systems were not designed for. Here, that trust in automation was compounded by a distraction. First, the broken bulb distracted the pilots. Someone should have been flying the plane, but everyone was trying to solve the bulb problem. In this situation, one pilot should be tasked with fixing the problem, and the other should monitor instruments and fly the plane. Otherwise, a bulb that costs $12 might just take 101 lives. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. The YouTube algorithm really likes that, and it will help a lot more people discover my channel. A big thank you to Ryan Bomar for letting me use his amazing footage on my videos. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe and wash your hands.